Welcome back to Ethical Cases with Hannah. I'm Hannah Oliveros, and today's episode is an analysis of the most recent and shocking news of a 14-year-old, Hamid Nosto, who jumped off of Patulo Bridge. Hamid was a grade 9 student at Evercreek Secondary School in British Columbia. He was a smart student who liked horror movies, reading, dancing, and music. He never fit in at school and was bullied for years. Hamid's grieving mother, Nasima Nasto, says her son told the family in his note that bullying and taunting drove him to suicide. In the letter, he said, "Mom, I was teased at school by my mates, my classmates. Even my own friends laughed at me. They always called me Four Eyes, Big Nose, and Geek." He said in his suicide note, "I hate myself for doing this to you," he wrote to his parents. "I really hate myself, but there's no other way out." Hamid's mother says he refused to talk to school officials. His friends also felt powerless to stop the taunting he endured. "We stood up for him, but people couldn't get the hint that this was too far, and this pushed him," says one Evercreek student. His mother says one of his last wishes Hamid expressed in his suicide note was for people to stop harassing each other and to realize that teasing is hurtful. We are joined with my co-host for today's episode, youth suicide and mental health expert, Helen Yousef. Thank you for joining us, Helen. What are your thoughts about the case?
Well, in the aftermath of this event, I think we can all agree that parents and classmates are asking the inevitable question, why? We have seen far too many other young lives lost to suicide in this country. Names we recognize, Amanda Todd, Rehtaeh Parsons, each had their own story of heartache and isolation, and sadly, it is not uncommon. Statistics show in 2015, 35 children who were just 10 to 14 years old committed suicide in Canada. It was also the second leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds, with 203 deaths. Another recent suicide case is the Blue Whale Challenge, which originated in Russia. It goes on for a course of 50 days, and every day there is a different challenge, which gets more difficult. Eventually, on the 50th day, the person has to commit suicide. So there was a case where a 17-year-old Russian girl committed suicide because of this challenge. Suicide is a huge problem among youth in Canada and certainly the world, so it's definitely something we should work to prevent.
Since we're all asking the question why, what are we not doing right?
I think we're always one step behind on the problem on this. We're always responding to preventing suicide by lining up ambulances at the bottom of the bridge, essentially, instead of actually getting way further upstream where kids are struggling to begin with. When they're dealing with things like depression and anxiety, instead of just passing that off as a normal rite of passage for youth, it's not. Kids don't have to struggle like that. We need to do a better job of teaching the entire school community that it's okay to be different, and it's okay to reach out for help, and it's okay to struggle. But I think that's where we're failing.
We are also joined with philosophers and ethical theorists Aristotle, Immanuel, Kant, and Emmanuel Levinas. Thank you for being here to discuss this issue. Aristotle, what do you think about the increasing rates of suicide and the cases?
I think it's horrible to commit suicide by your own hands, or with assistance by another, because not only is it affecting people close to the victim, but it is also harming your community. A community needs social and economic productivity from its members to stay alive, but suicide is clearly a violation of this. As bad as it sounds, I think suicide is very cowardly. Being courageous means to respect things that are evil or cause fear. We do such a thing by enduring or putting up with it. It's very cowardly, however, to simply escape such issues like bullying or poverty without having a true end to your life. However, the only suicide I see as acceptable and not cowardly is forced suicide. If the state orders someone to kill themselves, they will be killed whether they agree to commit suicide or not.
These people do take their community, their family, friends, environment into consideration when contemplating suicide, and they're aware of the consequences, but sometimes it gets too overwhelming to the point where it reaches that option. Don't you think that you're disregarding how they're feeling, which is one of the reasons why people consider suicide in the first place?
As I mentioned previously on courage, the victim to certain issues should endure them by not only putting up with them, but as well as getting help from other people, such as suicide prevention hotlines, or even talking about their problems with their families and friends to solve the issue. If the issue is poverty, there are still many places to turn to, such as soup kitchens or homeless shelters. As I said previously, you must endure the issues. Wait, and eventually the problem will be resolved. Many issues that lead to suicide have some sort of solution. If you have no close relatives or friends to turn to, you can always contact many organizations which help people with their issues, such as the International Association for Suicide Prevention.
Okay, I see. You're basically saying that you're not disregarding their feelings. Rather, you're trying to help them.
Yes, there are more options out there to help these people that they don't realize could prevent them from taking their life. They just have to take one step further and use them.
Kent, what are your thoughts on this case and the issue of youth suicide?
One who takes his own life acts in violation of the moral law. Suicide and assisted suicide are therefore wrong. When someone commits suicide, they are just using themselves as a means to escape the pain. When you treat someone as a means, you are using him or her to benefit yourself to achieve a final goal. I believe that those who use themselves as a means are showing disrespect to themselves and to others around them. The act of killing yourself is using the death of your body as the means for you to reach your end. The idea of humanity and life on earth, I feel, is a gift, and when someone chooses to kill themselves, they are not only disrespecting themselves, they are also valuing their death as more important than living. To me, the increasing rates of suicide are ridiculous. No matter how hard things get, just deal with the circumstances and respect humanity as an end itself. Man is God's property, and we have no right to dispose of our own lives.
Most suicides and assisted suicides are due to internal conflicts, such as the cases we have discussed today. Do you believe that forced suicide from external conflicts, such as the blue whale game, are acceptable? Most of the time, these people do it to escape the pain, or they do it to avoid embarrassment.
Any form of suicide is not permissible. It degrades the worth of a human being. I believe that we are all rational beings and therefore must act as such. Rationality should define a human being from any other animal. We should not act in ways that contradict the morals that make up our universal law. There should not be any obligation to commit suicide. If someone were to commit suicide, they would do so not because they have a right, but because they obey to committing suicide. Therefore, committing suicide is unreasonable, and nobody should choose suicide or be forced into the wrongful act.
Levinas, what are your opinions about the case at hand and youth suicide in general?
Suicide and assisted suicide are not acceptable in my books. Suicide is a logically contradictory concept because in the choice of death, ethical responsibility turns into irresponsibility. In other words, by killing yourself, you may think you are putting yourself out of your misery, but your actions are actually irresponsible and even immoral. However, I can understand forced suicide because in this scenario, death is inevitable. For instance, if one refuses to commit suicide, they will be killed by someone else.
If forced suicide isn't one's fault, but the events or actions that lead them to this point, what factors do you think influence assisted suicide or suicide in general?
I believe the trauma people have faced in their childhood, depression, and mental illness all contribute to suicide. For example, the emotional and physical abuse endured by an abusive parent can truly scar a child for life and even cause them to end their own life. Also, many victims of suicide suffered from depression and ended their life because they were demoralized all the time. Often, abundance of stress, attempting to escape from the symptoms, and unintentional suicide can lead to one's demise.
That's very true. It has been reported that depression increases the odds of suicide by 20 times, so it's no surprise that over 87% of suicides involve at least one mental disorder.
So, Helen, what do you think people should take away from this case?
Well, it's very important for people to recognize the signs of suicide before it happens, and one of the major risk factors is depression. There also needs to be a better job supporting the kids at risk. Talk, listen, and ask kids what they need for help. Don't assume you know the answer, just listen.
And this wraps up this episode of Ethical Cases with Hannah. Stay tuned for next week.